Is it? Oh, maybe I did, yeah. Because I had it unplugged for a little while. I was just kind of.
That's a power saver.
All right. There we are.
Oh,
Did I go back?
it left the meeting.
There we go.
Alrighty. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for coming to join us today. We're really pleased to be here to talk with you a little bit about trains. Let's start with some introductions. I am Patrick Carnahan, co-executive director of All Aboard Washington, along with my colleague Charlie over here.
I'm Charlie Hamilton, the other half.
I'm Nancy Goodlow from the Ellensburg City Council.
I'm Louis Musso from Cleveland, All Aboard Washington member, and I've been involved for appallingly 20 years now in passenger rail promotion.
I'm Steve Hayden. I restored the train station, Friends of the Northern Pacific Depot, been a member. I can't remember how many years, over 10 years with All Aboard Washington, worked a lot. So quite fun.
Corey Wright, Kittitas County Commissioner. Steve Townsend, Managing Partner at Hotel Winthrop.
Charles Smith, Kittitas County Chamber of Commerce.
Amy McGuffin, CEO of Kittitas County Chamber.
Warren Yee, I'm one of the directors of All Aboard Washington. Like Louis, I've been around for quite a while. Too.
Kathy Davis, All Aboard Washington.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Very happy to have this conversation. Glad to have a good group of people who have an interest in the project and who are involved with Ellensburg and the greater Kittitas Valley region. So glad to be here to have this conversation. Charlie and I have been on the road for quite a while. This is actually the last day of our trip, our last meetings for what we are calling the 2021 train trek. We got on the road last Thursday, the 12th, starting off in the Puget Sound, made our way to Leavenworth and Wenatchee, spent the day in the Yakima Valley, and made our way to the southeast corner of the state in Lewiston, Idaho, before we headed on to the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Summit, annual summit in Big Sky, Montana, where Charlie and I participated in their first ever rail forum, which is something that Bruce Agnew put together. I believe he's with Cascadia Institute, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so we had a great opportunity to speak there and be involved with a lot of the partners, all across the region who are working on rail restoration efforts and who have an interest in passenger and freight rail. From there, we made our way back to Spokane, had a meeting at the airport there with some officials there from the city and from Spokane Transit. And then just yesterday, we visited Cheney and Ritzville, had tons of people attend there, lots of interest, great conversations. And we even got a tour of the city of Ritzville, which was really awesome. Got to see their depot and a lot of their downtown restoration efforts, which are just amazing. So here we are today in Ellensburg, and later on this afternoon, we'll be wrapping it up with our All Aboard Washington annual picnic in Cle Elum, just across from the old South Cle Elum Milwaukee Road Depot. So that'll be really cool. That'll be my first time going there. This event was a big undertaking. This is something we were hoping to do last year originally. Of course, under the pandemic, that brought on some challenging circumstances. But we're glad we could do it this year, and we've received a lot of support from a number of different individuals who are involved with our organization, whether as volunteers or as members or as supporters. And we're thankful to all of the individuals who have donated and contributed, toward making this happen. We're also very thankful to the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority in Montana for supporting us. For those of you who might not have heard, last year, a group of counties along the southern tier of Montana came together. County Commissioner David Strohmeyer kind of spearheaded the effort, and he found within Montana state law a statute that would allow for the establishment of a rail authority on the county level, a union of counties. that could join together to support rail restoration projects in the state. So that happened. I think it's now up to 15 counties. He said while we were in Montana, they were working on getting support for from the 16th county. So it's a really amazing effort, and we're really glad for their support and collaboration. We know that they're going to be a big partner as we're working to expand service across the Northwest and talk about what the opportunities are. So thanks to the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority for their support. So who is All Aboard Washington? Some of you are members or have been involved with our organization for a while. For those of you who don't know us, we've been around for a while. We've been championing passenger and freight rail services in the Northwest for over 40 years, particularly active on the passenger side over the past couple of decades. We're a nonprofit group consisting of a number of individuals, businesses, and other groups. I think we're part of a kind of an increasingly large coalition of nonprofit organizations that want to make a difference in terms of transportation across the entire Northwest, particularly here in Washington. We've been around for a while, but I think a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years has really shown, the increasing prominence of passenger rail and freight rail work. So we're really glad to be involved with that. And we're here to talk today about three basic things. Number one, what are our 3 E's, our guiding principles as an organization, and how do they connect to transportation as a whole within our state and our region? Number two, what are our current efforts? What are the things that we've been working on as an organization in order to meet our mission and our vision? And number three, how can you help? What can you, as a citizen, as a representative in the media, whatever your role might be, what can you do to help advance passenger rail? And how can we help you do that as an organization? And kind of once we're done with that, we'd like to have a discussion. We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to get your ideas, hear what sort of efforts you've been involved with, and see how we can work together, how we can collaborate, to make things happen. So let's get started with a pretty simple question. What is world-class transportation? Because it's easy to go in all sorts of different directions with things, but let's start. We often hear about trains, and particularly we hear about a lot of fancy kind of modern trains. Maybe we hear about that the Link Light Rail over in Seattle, maybe we hear about the Shinkansen in Japan, the bullet train, or perhaps we're hearing about some of these futuristic maglev or hyperloop projects that are being talked about. A lot of times when we talk about quote unquote world-class transportation, or we think about really good transportation, we think about trains in some way, shape, or form, right? Particularly fast trains, high-speed rail, stuff along those lines. But what we've come to recognize here at All Aboard Washington is that it's a lot more than just trains. It's not, when we're talking about making a really good transportation system, it's not just about mode. It's really about how things connect together. So if you talk about walking out your front door, you've got to have a sidewalk or maybe a bike path. Maybe you need to hop on a local bus. Or maybe an intercity bus. Perhaps maybe you have a train station in your town, whether that's a streetcar or a light rail, something like Amtrak Cascades or one of the Amtrak long distance trains. When you're talking about getting places, there's a lot that connects into that. It's really creating a system, having a system of different transportation modes that allows you to get from wherever you are to wherever it is you want to go. So if we really want to boil it down to what is world-class transportation, we have to, what transportation is all about, it's this. Is it reasonably easy to get from here to there? Is it affordable? Is it not a pain? Can you get close enough to where you want to go that, you can get there, or you can be picked up, or, however that might work. We know right now, most of the time, the reality is it isn't really easy. Even sometimes within the Seattle area, let alone outside of the Seattle area. Charlie and I did a routing to try to see how hard it would be to get from his place in Capitol Hill to Cle Elum. And that's less than a 2-hour drive down the freeway, right? Shouldn't be that hard. Well, what we found out was that if we were going to take the existing options, it would take 19 hours and 49 minutes. We would have to hop on the Empire Builder to Wenatchee, which is a beautiful train ride. But we would get there at night. Then we have to spend the night in Wenatchee, wait several hours overnight in Wenatchee. Then the next day, there would be a bus that would take us here to Ellensburg. Then we would wait probably another hour or two in Ellensburg before then we could hop on a bus that actually connects to Cle Elum. What a hassle for something that should be a tenth of that time. Similarly, we did a routing from Spokane to Walla Walla, same side of the state. There are some direct road connections. It shouldn't be that hard, right? Wrong. 8 hours by bus. And we actually had to go down, we would have to go down into Oregon. We'd have to go down to Umatilla, change buses in Umatilla to Pendleton, then change buses again to get back up to Walla Walla, leaving the state to get somewhere within your own state. And we recognize that today. The reality in central and eastern Washington, really across the entire Northwest region, is that you don't have a lot of options. Really, your two biggest options most of the time are, cars and planes. You get your choice of having a good enough job that you can afford to buy a car and maintain a car and have a license and, pay for the registration on your car and pay for insurance on your car, for all of the year. And then if it's summer, you get to deal with construction and traffic. And if it's the winter, you get to get on your knees, put on your chains and hope that the pass isn't closed. Or you get the other wonderful choice of dealing with flights, and if you're going anywhere but SeaTac or Spokane, pull out your wallet and pay $240 for a one-way from Yakima to Spokane. That's what I found when I was looking at that. If some trips come, so quickly you can't book it 2 weeks in advance. So we recognize that makes it so hard to get across the region. That makes our region so much more disconnected than it really ought to be. And that has a lot of implications for people. And we know that this has been the circumstance for quite a while. This isn't something that's happened overnight. Ellensburg used to be served by trains up until 1981. A lot of things, kind of started in 1979 when one of the Amtrak routes serving the area between Seattle and Chicago was canceled. But then in 1981, the route that was left was rerouted back to Stampede Pass, where the earlier train had been canceled, leaving the Yakima and Kittitas valleys completely out of the passenger rail system. And the story was, okay, yeah, well, the buses will take over, right? Well, look at where Greyhound bus is now. We were told yesterday that there used to be as many as 8 buses serving Ritzville, and now that's down to 1. I think that's the same in Ellensburg, if I'm not mistaken. The Greyhound services declined across the Northwest. Their Bolt bus brand on the I-5 corridor recently collapsed as a result of the pandemic. We know how expensive the SeaTac charter buses are if you try to get on Bel Air, and then you have to hope that the passes aren't closed for that either. If you're going anywhere but Seattle or Spokane, a lot of times the flights are very expensive and you have to go through either one of those hubs, making it more difficult, more time consuming, more costly. And then a lot of the communities along existing lines simply don't have service. Whether that's because, the line has been canceled or whether that's because the Amtrak train passes right through. So there are a number of big issues impacting central and eastern Washington when it comes to transportation. And unfortunately, the pandemic made things worse for quite a while. The daily Amtrak Cascades service, which went 4 times a day between Seattle and Portland, 2 times a day between Portland and Eugene, and 2 times a day between Seattle and Vancouver, Canada, was cut to a single trip a day between Seattle and Eugene, and all the service north of Seattle was suspended. Then the Empire Builder, part of which goes from Seattle to Spokane via Wenatchee and Leavenworth, and part of which goes from Portland to Spokane via the Columbia River. That was cut down to just 3 times a week. Who can plan a trip around 3 times a week service? You don't even have daily there. But thankfully, things are starting to get better as people have gotten a little bit more comfortable with traveling, and as vaccination rates have increased, Amtrak and WashDOT did increase service. The Amtrak Cascades got back to 3 trips a day between Seattle and Portland, 2 between Portland and Eugene. And then all of the long distance routes, including the Empire Builder, were restored to daily service. And ridership was recovering even before these. People were really itching to get out, and there were a lot of people who, whether it was because of a change in job, maybe moving due to sort of this digital revolution that we're seeing and working, more people working remotely, or, because a lot of these services were simply necessities in the communities that they served. Ridership stayed pretty strong after the initial decline. And in fact, on a per train basis, given the number of trains available and given the capacity constraints, Amtrak Cascades was performing just as well as, if not, better than it was pre-pandemic, even before the restoration of trains. So that shows that there's still a lot of demand for travel. People still want to get out and people still want to experience the Northwest. So, that gets us to, what is the need for better intercity trains? How do trains make a difference? Why are they so important? And it's really down to these three guiding principles of our organization, what we like to kind of call the 3 E's: local and regional economic development, environmental stewardship, and equity. We believe that a truly well thought out and well implemented intercity passenger rail service, intercity passenger rail network, and connecting bus services can do a lot to address all three of these issues. Let's start with economics. When it's harder to travel, people don't travel as much. According to Amtrak's own data, 11% of train riders in Washington state right now, and that includes both the Cascades and the Empire Builder, would not have chosen to travel had the train not been available to them as an option. Whether that's because there were simply no services that exist, whether that's because the train provides a more convenient service to what they have right now, or whether that's because they can't afford to travel by other modes. And that makes a huge impact across our state. What we understand, according to Experience Washington, is that the average day trip visitor spends $84 in the communities that they visit and $366 in communities that they spend overnight. And that adds up. If east-west service were to be restored in Washington, daytime service, connecting Seattle and Spokane via the Yakima and Kittitas valleys, that would add up to over $7 million in additional tourist spending across the entire state. And we know that that makes a big impact in communities like Ellensburg. That's an enormous difference. And that's just of a train, going twice a day between Seattle and Spokane, let alone if we were to be looking at something that went even better. Then there's a question of equity. I don't know if you guys have heard this. This is a fun fact Charlie and I discovered. Some people in Washington state actually live outside of Seattle. Isn't that amazing? I was so shocked when I heard about that, because if you ask a lot of people in Seattle, there's this Seattle mindset about things. But in fact, there are communities all across our state that have tremendous transportation needs, that are, wonderful places to visit, wonderful people, wonderful sites, wonderful restaurants, wonderful businesses. That are simply not connected to the network because of how we've been thinking about things. We know that Puget Sound communities aren't the only ones who benefit from better rail and transit. And there are places across the country that are discovering this and that are taking action. A great example is the state of Virginia. A couple of years ago, the state DOT was conducting a study of trying to relieve traffic congestion on I-95, very much like I-5. Sound familiar? Lane expansion work on I-90 in the mountains, a couple $100 million, maybe even throw a low B in there, $1 billion. And what Virginia found with that project was that in order to add a single lane in each direction between Washington, D.C. and Fredericksburg, maybe about 50 miles or so, that was going to cost somewhere on the order of $12.5 billion. It would take 10 years for the project to be complete. Would be just as full as they were before, and the traffic would be just as slow as it was 10 years earlier. So, the DOT looked at that, and then they went one step further. They asked the question of, what could we do if we spent that money on something else? What if we invested the money in a different mode of transportation? What could we get? And what they found was that for a third of that, less than $4 billion, they could buy all of the tracks listed there in yellow, urban, rural, north, south, east, west tracks. They could improve the existing commuter rail service between Fredericksburg and Washington, D.C. To make it a lot more frequent, a lot more reliable. And they could start intercity passenger rail services like Amtrak trains, like Amtrak Cascades, across the entire state, serving the vast majority of the state's population for a third of the price of this highway expansion. And that's exactly what they did. Virginia embarked on what is by far the most ambitious private rail acquisition project in the entire country. They bought a lot of infrastructure, a lot of right-of-way, of revitalizing a lot of that infrastructure, such as the Long Bridge, which connects Virginia with Washington, DC. And they're busily finding out how they can expand passenger rail services to every corner of the state in rural and urban communities. This is what we call equity. And another great example that ties into this is what's going on in the states of North Carolina and California with regards to connecting bus service. Both states operate passenger rail, state-supported services, very similar to Amtrak Cascades. And they also operate a bus network that connects with it. Washington has a small one, but the networks in North Carolina and California are pretty extensive. In North Carolina, what they do is they connect the buses with the trains along former rail right-of-ways, former rail routes, and connecting a lot of their biggest cities. And they use them as a test to see what sort of demand is there, what sort of service could we do if that was available, if people were able to take the route. And what they found was that some of the routes were busy enough to actually justify the starting of passenger rail services. That's why if you look at Amtrak Connects Us 2035, some of the routes included in that are in North Carolina, and those are based off of the connecting bus services that the state sponsored to complement its existing Piedmont and Carolinian passenger rail services. Similarly, the state of California operates a very expansive bus network that connects to a lot of its passenger rail lines. And one of the great examples of that, as you can see kind of with the blue line in the middle, is with their San Joaquin service, which connects the state capital of Sacramento and the San Francisco Bay Area with the Central Valley of California down as far south as Bakersfield. They can't extend the train south of Bakersfield due to some track capacity constraints. But what they do is they connect a lot of buses to that route in particular. In fact, the program spends about 25% of its budget on the buses that connect to the trains, but it pays off. According to a webinar they hosted a couple of months ago called Corridor Conversations, the representatives with Amtrak San Joaquin's stated that 57% of their riders use a connecting bus on one or both ends of their trip. So that provides a lot of connectivity into places that don't currently have service, and that really extends the network to go well beyond just the rail corridors and well beyond just the urban corridors, really to serve the entire state and the entire region. And that's exactly what we at Walla think we should be doing. We should be finding out how, we should be having conversations on how we can better expand passenger rail services on existing infrastructure. We should be doing a better cost benefit analysis of what we're paying for roads versus what we're getting out of them, and what we could do if we were to invest the same money or perhaps even a fraction of that into passenger rail. And similarly, we think that we should be ambitiously expanding our state's connecting bus program, working as much with other existing operators to make sure that there's good connectivity across the entire state and not just in the Puget Sound corridor. We also think it's really important that that there's an emphasis on equity, that it's not just talking about travel time saved. The US DOT for a very long time has given a huge weight toward travel time saved, that the highway lobby consultants have gotten really good at modifying to justify highway projects. They've come up with really good calculations that say if you add a lane, theoretically, it allows X number of cars to move per hour, meaning that 20 billion seconds are saved every year by this project, and therefore let's build another highway. But the DOT, understands now that is not the case, that is not reality, that it doesn't really save anybody any time, and that it doesn't, this sort of criteria, this sort of weighting on travel time saved doesn't actually improve the travel situation for most people. So the DOT has modified its cost benefit analyses criteria in order to better weigh factors like equity and like safety, like environmental impact. All of these things are now going to be given a much more fair sort of share in their consideration of US DOT grants. Then finally, environmental stewardship. According to the data that we have less than 10 years to cut our emissions by 45%, our greenhouse gas emissions by 45% of 2010 levels in order to avert the worst effects of climate change. And here we are, talking about a 20 to 30 year high-speed rail project in the Puget Sound. We would love to see high-speed rail as an organization, don't get us wrong, but what we recognize is that we have a lot of tremendous short-term needs, stuff that needs to be taken care of over the next 10 years, communities across the entire state and not just in the I-5 corridor that need to have their mobility needs addressed and that need to be contributing to better environmental and economic development efforts. So we can't just be focused on high-speed rail. We need to have, I think, a broader conversation on what are we doing in the short term? How are we building up to high-speed rail so that way it actually makes sense to do that down the road? We need to take short-term steps. And when it comes to the environment, we know that it's really about addressing what happens with transportation and with cars. Transportation is the largest contributor to US greenhouse gas emissions at about 29%. And according to the EPA, highway traffic of all sorts, whether that's personal cars or whether that's large semi trucks, account for about 82 or 83% of our emissions. So we need to be focusing on things that shift our emissions away from cars. According to that same data, rail only, despite the fact that it carries millions of passengers every single year across the country, and countless tons of freight, from coast to coast, rail only contributes 2.6% of transportation emissions. So there's a big opportunity to reduce the overall emissions intensity of our transportation network by better using our rail. And we understand that we're not making good use of our rail right now. According to one of someone who's worked with Allboard Washington for a while, who was previously engaged in a lot of transportation and particularly rail consulting efforts, the US is 40th in the world in terms of how well it leverages its rail system, how well it makes use of its existing rails. And that's behind Mozambique. Literally, Mozambique is making better use of the tracks and the infrastructure it has than we are. And that's clear when we look at all of the empty tracks, all of the abandoned tracks, all of the single tracking, all of the old signal and switching systems, all these things across Washington, let alone across our country. So we really need to be focusing on how to make use of the better infrastructure we have over the next decade. So that way, we can build up to high-speed rail and we're not depending on high-speed rail in 20 or 30 years to be our savior and grace. So all of this is kind of articulated in All Aboard Washington's vision. And if we could say that in just a single sentence, that would be, with prudent short-term investments, we believe Washington State can revive its rail revolution and get back on track toward creating a truly world-class transportation network. Many of you might remember in the early 1990s when the state had a plan for implementing high-speed rail across the whole state. And it's, that was what brought about Amtrak Cascades. That's what brought about the initial East-West study to restore service through Stampede Pass. And then things just kind of seemed to stop. We have gotten off track and we've lost focus of what's going on. Now we have a single high-speed rail project serving this whole corridor that's not considering the whole state. And we believe at All Aboard Washington that we need to be having a strong vision and a serious conversation about how do we take that short-term action to get back on track toward creating not just a good rail network, but really a world-class statewide and region-wide transportation network that better connects the communities who need to be connected, the communities who need these services and who need this investment. I see it's gotten a little bit darker there, but you can still see the map here. So to get it started, this isn't our full map of what we believe all of the possibilities are. We know that there are a lot of opportunities to expand, bus and train services across the entire state. There are a lot more existing right-of-ways that would totally make sense for new regional services, cities and corridors that would absolutely deserve better investment and more investment and connectivity. But we believe that this is a good conversation starter. And we believe that this is the bare minimum that our state should have in order to say that connectivity, an acceptable level of connecting most of the state's population, most of our big cities, our small towns, our really critical regions together in order to make sure that there is better equity, that there is better investment. And if we can summarize kind of what's listed here, that is the restoration of daytime train services between Seattle and Spokane via the Kittitas and Yakima valleys. That is the extension of connecting buses to more communities that deserve them. That's the improvement of the Amtrak Cascade system to improve ridership and to really show what's possible with better investment in passenger rail on an existing corridor, and more stations where in communities that aren't currently served by the train, whether that's in Ritzville or Blaine, whether that's Connell or Cheney. So this is kind of our vision map for that, for what we think at least is a good short-term actionable set of steps that we can take. And what we'll be focusing on today is what, a project that we know would mean a lot to Ellensburg, and that would be the restoration of east-west daytime passenger trains across Stampede Pass on the existing tracks. The project, as described by Washed Out right now, would be 1 or 2 trains a day between Seattle and Spokane, starting at each end, one probably in the morning and one probably in the afternoon, with stops along the way in Tukwila, Auburn, Cle Elum, Ellensburg, Yakima, Toppenish, and Pasco, before continuing on to either end. This project has been around for a while. Some of you might have known back in the early 2000s, after the successful rollout of Amtrak Cascades on the I-5 corridor, that Washed Out started to turn its attention toward what could be done with East-West, what sort of train service could be started there, while the state is working on, the statewide high-speed rail project, to at least get something started there. And that initial feasibility study was very positive. While it indicated long run times, it indicated that the service is in fact technically and operationally feasible. There are not too many freight trains running on the route that would impede passenger trains, and the infrastructure is already there. A few minor improvements along the way would easily accommodate passenger trains. Unfortunately, we may all remember that this was also right after the passage of initiative, the passage, then failure, and then re-implementation of Initiative 695, which completely destroyed the state's transportation budget, particularly for the ferries, for existing bus services, and it also hurt the Amtrak Cascades program. So at this point, the DOT just didn't have the resources to continue looking into east-west service, and so it went for a long time without any action. In the middle of last decade, All Aboard Washington approached Central Washington University about the possibility of conducting a marketing study to, really, continue to talk about this project, to talk about the interest, to get a sense from people, what are their needs, where would they want to go, what is the demand for better east-west passenger rail service. And Professor John Bowen and his students found that there was in fact tremendous interest and tremendous support among residents of Central Washington who they interviewed for this service. And they found that it wouldn't just be a service for, getting down the street, just to the next town, that people who were surveyed wanted to use it to go across the entire state. Some people would want to go to Spokane, some people would want to go to Seattle, some people would want to go to Lacey or Tacoma. This would be something that wouldn't just connect this region, but it would really be a backbone for connecting the entire state from west to east. We brought that to the legislature over the course of the next couple of years, and in 2019 we were successful in convincing them to fund the next level of study beyond the first feasibility study in order to look at the service, which would assess the ridership, some of the capital needs, some of the more specific operational challenges, and more of the specific costs of actually trying to start the service. And from that, we got a lot of great information. Steer, the consulting firm that was hired to conduct the study, found just right along the lines of All Aboard Washington that there was tremendous community support. Two things that really stand out are that they found that 77% of participants expressed moderate or strong support for the project, and over 70% of people surveyed said that they would use the service if it was made available to them, that it was something that they would actually make use of. They also found that despite the fact that it is a long corridor by state standards, taking a long time to run from end to end, probably in the range of 8.5 hours, that it would still generate ridership that was pretty tremendous. That North Carolina state-supported train I was talking about before connects the state's largest cities along a much shorter corridor and a much more densely populated corridor. Yet this east-west project was found to have ridership that would be very competitive with that. I think that this is just a little bit short of that, if not a little bit, perhaps even a little bit better than what was being talked about in North Carolina. And that's with 3 or 4 trains a day along that corridor, while this would only be 1 or 2. And the cost, while certainly not tiny, when we compare it to a lot of the other investments that our state makes in transportation, like those Olympic class ferries, this is, or maybe a few miles of lane expansion on I-90 or I-5. This would be very competitive with that for a corridor that would cover the entire state, less than $500 million, according to Steer, to get the service started with 2 trains a day all the way from Seattle to Spokane via the Kittitas and Yakima valleys. There were still some things that we disagreed with, points that we thought were really worth re-examining, particularly the ridership model, which we understand only accounted for people who were driving. If you remember that slide I showed before with the pie chart about who uses Amtrak in Washington State, which is according to Amtrak's own data, only 47% of riders who ride the train in Washington would actually use the car as the alternative. The rest would either ride a plane, shell out the money for a plane ticket, take the bus if it was available and if it was convenient enough to connect, or like I mentioned before, 11% simply would not travel. That means that in total, about 53% of train riders in Washington State, 53% of the potential ridership for this east-west service was simply not accounted for. They didn't account for any diversion from any other modes. They didn't account for any induced travel demand. They left out the 20% of Washingtonians who don't have a license. So we think that they may have underestimated ridership by as much as half. If talking about the data that we have on existing Amtrak routes within the state, which include a mix of urban and rural services, not just the Amtrak Cascades trains. Additionally, Steer made the argument that it would be difficult to justify investing in the project because it would take so long to get from endpoint to endpoint. And yes, we know that, the travel time we're talking about, which as of this study was estimated at 8.5 hours, is a very long time from endpoint to endpoint. We recognize in particular that the section between Cle Elum and Seattle would take a long time due to the mountainous terrain. But of course, that's not the purpose of East-West Rail. The purpose of East-West Rail is not to provide the fastest way to get from Seattle to Spokane. It's not the fastest way to get from endpoint to endpoint. What it's really about is connecting communities in the middle with each other and with the endpoints better than any of the existing route options that exist right now. It's about providing transportation alternatives, having another route just in case the I-90 passes are closed. It's about having a more accessible option that enables people who cannot drive to get where they want to go without having to shell out the money for a plane ticket from a smaller airport closer to where they live. It's about providing these better connections, an option that doesn't exist. That's really in the end, the travel time is not the most important model here. It's about the equity, it's about the safety, it's about the accessibility. So that's what it's about. And really, even more than that, it's really down to the public support, which according to Steer is exceptionally strong. Steer, the gentleman who presented to the Joint Transportation Commission after the Joint Transportation Committee after the completion of the study stated that his firm had never seen support for a rail project, or really any sort of infrastructure project that high ever. 70% of people said they would ride. Almost 80% of people said that they supported the service. Stakeholders, in particular, the cities of Yakima and Pasco, the Yakima Nation, and even representatives from BNSF Railway, the railroad who owns the tracks, who would have to be hosting the trains, expressed support for the project. Everybody who talked about this understood the importance, the significance of this project.
We
And
might
there's a
mention,
lesson. Oh, yes.
Patrick, that the gentleman who made that statement was from England and had done studies all over the world. He was actually referring to the highest support anywhere worldwide, not just in the United States.
And I think we all recognize, just how significant that is, and it really makes sense when you think about it because of the serious lack of options that we have, and moreover the division that we face. I think in our state, just the separation that the mountains and the rivers provide between people. People here, I think, innately recognize the importance of trying to bridge these gaps, trying to overcome these divisions, trying to get through the mountains, get through the rivers, because it's meaningful, because it's something that impacts our society. It's something that impacts our daily lives. Two very close family friends of mine who I basically consider to be like my West Coast grandmas have they share in this struggle. One of them, they both live on the Kitsap Peninsula. One has a son who lives in Stanwood, and she talks about how scary it is to try to drive on I-5 anymore, to get through the Seattle and Tacoma traffic, to try to deal with, the ferry schedules when they're sometimes taking a boat off, waiting in line for hours, and then, trying to navigate your way through Edmonds and make your way back up to Stanwood. And similarly, kind of my other grandma, her sister lives in Walla, and her husband, my great aunt's husband, just recently passed away. Her family is really busy with things, and can't. It doesn't have a lot of the time or the availability to help her come over to the west side and visit my grandma in Bremerton. And my grandma, similarly, her husband passed away a while ago, and so we really have, my mom and I have to be there to help her out with that, and we're happy to do it, and I feel. I've still got reflexes that are good enough. I usually have enough coffee to make my way over the passes, but I recognize that communities across this entire state on both sides of the mountains, north and south, east and west, are suffering as a result of these lack of connections, these lack of options, not having a train or a bus available that's close enough to where you live, and that's affordable enough. That all affects our independence and our ability to see family and friends, to get to medical services, all of these things. So we think the bottom line is that the public support for this project really is an illustration of just how much we need it, and just how much of an impact this would make. And Steer says that there is a lot more work to do, but that is the next step, that we need to define the service a little bit more specifically. We think at All Aboard Washington that it's worth looking into more departures and more potential connections beyond just the Seattle to Spokane. Once the tracks between Auburn and the Tri-Cities are restored, we know that it would be pretty easy. There are other existing tracks that go to Walla, and there are other existing tracks that down to Oregon to connect into Boise. We think that there should be a lot more to be looked at beyond just this, just Seattle to Spokane. And we think that offering all of these services connecting across the entire region really brings us closer together as a Northwest. And it opens up so many possibilities for people in every city along the line, in every state, in every county. So that brings us to what are we asking for in Olympia? What are the big needs here? What do we think are the action items that we're able to do? The first is taking the next step for east-west trains. In order for the east-west project as it exists right now to be eligible for federal grant opportunities, which we understand are going to expand significantly, we need to conduct two type of analyses that need to be funded by the state. The first is a benefit cost analysis, which looks at the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly reduced emissions if we're able to get more people to ride the train and not rely as much on other more carbon intensive modes of transportation. The safety benefits, that we know that trains, on the whole are very, very safe. It makes the news when a train has an accident. Meanwhile, while I was at this Penmore forum, a representative from an autonomous vehicles company talked about how every single day, 5 days a week, every week of the year, the traffic deaths are the equivalent to a Boeing 737 falling out of the sky 5 days a week, every week of the year. So we recognize that there are tremendous safety impacts that being able to ride a train has, particularly when you're getting a little older and you're not able to have as good reflexes as before. And we also understand that the state has goals for reducing vehicle miles traveled. There are impacts for that, being able to ride the train and not having to rely on a car for every single trip in any direction helps. So a benefit cost analysis would look at these sorts of things. And then an economic analysis would measure the impact on the communities along the route. What happens when those 11% of potential riders have more access? What are the impacts on communities, whether it's with jobs, whether it's with spending, tax revenues, general quality of life, property values, All these things are impacted by the existence of passenger rail service, and an economic analysis measures those. So if we can have these two studies conducted by the state, an economic analysis and a cost benefit analysis, those are two of the for East West to be eligible for federal funding, which we know is increasing in DC, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in just a moment. The second is trying to restore and expand service as much as possible, and there's lots of different parts of that. Part of that is Amtrak Cascades. We know that the trains north of Seattle, particularly those serving Skagit and Whatcom counties, have been stopped, meaning that it's a lot harder to have that connection anywhere south of there, and to get to any of the services, whether in Seattle or Portland, that connect you to the rest of the region. So we're having talks with WashDOT and with others about, kind of what's the timeline for that. We understand that the border complications are making that challenging. We're waiting on some more news on sort of what the US's policy with regards to Canadians crossing the border will be. But I think once we hear more information on that, we'll have a more sure timeline on what will be possible with restoring trains to Northwest Washington, and not just restoring the existing frequencies that were happening before the pandemic, but there's a lot more to it. We think that Amtrak Cascades should be expanded, and that's thanks to a lot of the research that my colleague Abe Zubwalt conducted earlier on what happens when you expand the frequency of a train. What he found through his research examining all of the Amtrak state-supported routes was that once you kind of hit this magical number of 6 to 8 trains a day along because at 6 to 8 trains a day, you don't have to be looking at schedule. You don't have to be looking at your watch. You can kind of just show up, and a train will be there. There'll be a later train. There'll be an earlier train. You have more options. If something happens and a train is delayed or a train gets canceled, you still have an option to get there. And that just makes the service so much more useful, and therefore more people choose to use it. And you can see kind of at the point where Amtrak Cascades was right before the pandemic, that we were hitting just shy of the 1 million rider mark. And we believe that if we're able to increase the frequency of Amtrak Cascades between Portland and Seattle from 4 trains a day to 6 trains a day, that would push us over the 1 million rider mark. And really, once we hit between 6 to 8 trips a day on Amtrak Cascades, that's probably going to be enough for a while. And then it would be a lot easier to turn our attention toward improving services in places where it's only 1 train a day or 0 trains a day, like right now. And that's a really important point. Like I mentioned, we hear all this stuff about high-speed rail, and our organization would absolutely love to see high-speed rail. But the bottom line is that the project, as it's envisioned right now, as it's being pushed forward by WashDOT and by our governor, is really only talking about a line that goes between Vancouver and Portland. It's not including the Part 2 Eugene, and it's not including any of those routes shaded in red. And we know that a lot of those routes shaded in red, central and eastern Washington, need service. And not 20 years from now or 30 years from now. There are needs that we need to solve yesterday, but that we think should be addressed, in the next decade or less, or sooner if possible. And really, if you look at the research on any high-speed rail system across the world, an analysis that Abe did of the 10 most advanced high-speed rail systems, the countries with the most trackage and the highest top speeds, 9 of those 10 were built on existing conventional rail services. They had really good existing train services. They made efforts to upgrade those as much as possible, and they really only started high-speed rail after they maxed those systems out, after they did everything they could with them. We're not doing anything close to everything we could be doing with our existing infrastructure, let alone, do we have the capacity to consider looking at building high-speed rail. So again, we want to see high-speed rail happen. We think that, if it does happen, it would be transformational for the entire Northwest, but it's only going to be transformational for the entire Northwest if it's connected to the entire Northwest. And that means we've got to figure out how to build these initial backbone conventional rail services and bus connections that mean that everybody is connected to the system and not just the I-5 corridor. And finally, improving feedback channels in Olympia. Did you know that if you walk into your county auditor's office and you pay for your car tabs at your county auditor's office, the $8 fee, which if you were going to a subcontractor or a franchisee, actually goes toward the state ferry system. So the $8 that you pay here in Kittitas County or in Spokane County or in Grant County, even though you're not served by the state ferry system, paying for your tabs at the county auditor's office funds the ferries. Why is that? How did that come about? Well, there's a lot of things that the ferry riders have as an advantage to the rest of the state, particularly east of the mountains. And part of that is that they have what's called the Ferry Riders Opinion Group, or the FROG, ribbit. And they make that FROG makes a lot of noise. The ferry riders have a tremendous voice in Olympia because the Ferry Riders Opinion Group, which reports to the Washington State Transportation Commission, is able to tell the commission, who is then able to talk with WashDOT about what are the concerns of ferry riders. They probably get feedback on potential funding sources. They get feedback on things that could be done, how we could improve the existing services, how the disruptions are affecting people. And that means that ferry riders really have a very strong, very loud voice when it comes to transportation policy in Washington State. But nothing exists like this for rail riders. Nothing exists like this for people who ride the intercity buses. And we need to change that. We need to have voices for people who are traveling across the strait, across county lines, and across the mountains, across our rivers, and not just on our ferries. And we think establishing perhaps we could call it a passenger rail opinion group, a PROG. I don't know what sound a PROG makes, but we want to make sure our rail riders have a louder voice in Olympia. We want to make sure we're hearing the feedback from people who depend on these services and from people who want to be better connected, who want to see trains come to their towns. We know that the Transportation Commission is very interested. Charlie and I and our Government Affairs Director, Luis Moscoso, we gave a presentation about a month or so ago to the Transportation Commission, and they're very interested in hearing more about passenger rail. In fact, really what they said is that they didn't even know that the East-West study had been done because nobody had been talking with them about that. There's not as much conversation going on about rail issues as there should be, and we think a passenger rail opinion group is a great first step toward changing that and making sure that rail is considered as part of the picture and that there is a little bit more balance between the ferries and between the rest of the state. Now, what are some of the challenges and the opportunities that we're facing? It's really down to three things: equipment, regional cooperation, and funding. The first, acquiring new equipment. It's something that people don't talk a whole lot about, but there is simply not enough train equipment in North America, across the US and Canada, to accommodate all of the potential service needs that we have today, let alone the growth that we're looking at in the future. A lot of the trains that we have on the existing Amtrak network are somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 years old, some older, a few newer, but we don't have the production, the manufacturing infrastructure to address that shortfall. You can't just go to your local train dealer and buy something off the lot and have it ready next week. Acquiring new train equipment, building new train equipment is a multi-year process, and there are not a lot of companies that have factories in the US to do that because of the fact that we don't have a steady, predictable stream of expansions and replacements. There are a few companies that have good manufacturing here. One of them is Siemens in California, and Siemens has been selected by Amtrak as the next manufacturer for Amtrak's next generation of equipment, which will be coming online in the next few years. But that means that we have at least a minimum of 3 to 4 years, perhaps even longer, to wait before we're going to see any of this in service and before we're even going to get close to addressing the shortfall that we have to build things. And while there are other manufacturers, a lot of them have limited capacity. Some of them, like Talgo, which made trains for Washington, went out of business in North America because of the politics of passenger rail expansion projects. Wisconsin canceled one of their projects against contract, and nobody else has ordered from Talgo since then because of all of the controversy going around that. So that makes it very difficult for the people who make trains to try to establish factories and for us to have a rolling supply chain. The second, and we believe that this is both a challenge and an opportunity, is regional cooperation and collaboration. There have been a lot of challenges trying to get WashDOT and ODOT to work together on projects crossing the state line. But there is evidence across the country that there are new models for how we can do things. One is the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority in Montana on the right, which is sort of a county level thing, knitting together the counties on the southern tier of Montana to work on passenger rail service. They've actually gotten together and agreed that they're going to try to come up with the funding and just the unity needed to improve rail in that section of the state. To assist with efforts to expand rail across the southern tier of the state, not just within the state, but even beyond to Seattle and to Chicago. So we believe if we could do something like that in Washington, that would be amazing. And secondly, there's also on the left, the Southern Rail Commission. This is a unity of states who create an interstate compact together in order to collaborate on rail issues. And the commission that is created by this compact actually can say, hey, we want to work on this project because we know it's going to be important for the entire region and not just any one of the states. And that's something that's just made its way through in the most recent Senate infrastructure bill, that there will be approval for up to 10 new commissions beyond just the Southern Rail Commission. And we think Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana should be participating in this to better link the entire region and provide the resources and the collaboration necessary to make better passenger rail a reality. Just something kind of in addition to this on the county level, and Lewis can talk about this a little bit, our county rail districts, which we understand Kittitas County could participate in. And then funding, which the county rail districts ties into this. We know that there are a lot of new opportunities going on at the federal level. We understand that USDOT grant criteria are now being changed to have a lot more emphasis on serving underserved communities that don't have existing service, communities that used to be served by Amtrak but no longer are, or communities that have never had any sort of rail or transit service. These places are now being considered a lot more strongly for better investment. And this is an interesting implication for East-West Rail as well. There's also a consideration for any rail corridors that connect any of the 100 largest metropolitan statistical areas in the country. It just so happens that Spokane, as of the 2020 census, is now MSA number 99. Seattle is number 15. Portland and Boise both placed within the list as well. And therefore, any project connecting these MSAs, regardless of which route it takes, is going to be more competitive for federal grant funding. That means that Seattle to Spokane might be more competitive. Seattle to Boise via the Yakima and Kittitas valleys could be more competitive. And that means that there's a lot more opportunity for investment. And then the Interstate Rail Compacts, the Southern Rail Commission I just mentioned before, would help provide funding for better research and better planning on these. And then Lewis, if you could just speak for a moment on what the county rail districts do and how Kittitas County could play a role in that.
Yeah. First, let me say this is the first time I've heard this presentation in its actual form, and I think Charlie and Patrick have done a remarkable job in condensing and clarifying what is one of the most confusing and in many ways nonsensical aspects of American transportation policy. We in Kittitas County are in a unique position. As a matter of fact, not everyone knows perhaps that we are sitting in the room with one of 3 people in this state who holds the title of County Rail District Commissioner. And that is, in fact, our county commissioner. Let me give you a bit of background. I won't take more than 5 or 10 minutes. Bruce and I have discussed this. I'm sorry he wasn't able to be here today, but we know it's going to take another local meeting directly focused on this to really make any sense out of it. But let me give you the introduction. As some of you know, and some of you probably don't, 20 years ago, there was a company called Trent West, and they were developing a resort that became Suncadia by way of being Mountain Star and various other machinations. 20 years ago, I was recruited by the then head of Trend West, Bill Pear, who still lives in Cleveland, to work on the possibility of connecting his resort with Seattle and the East Coast by rail. And his vision was based on the Canadian Pacific and Canadian Northern resorts in the Rockies that had been built at the turn of the last century. We succeeded in the 2001 legislative session in passing a bill that I drafted. Just happen to be good at that sort of thing. That allowed counties in this state to create, by vote of the people, passenger rail districts. Kittitas County, in fact, did that in 2007. Took a while to, between 2002 and 2007, to get everything put together. Unfortunately, there were major management changes at the resort. Bill Pear was in fact forced out by the then out-of-state financial owners, but people like Bill Hinkle, first as county commissioner and then as state legislator, and Matt Manweller bought into this idea. And we were able in 2007 to create the state's first and so far only passenger rail district. It does not tax. That's why it was able to be taxed. Port districts, for example, have failed every time they've been tried in Kittitas County in recent years because they have an automatic tax. So, and this was before any of the three present commissioners were in office. Paul Jewell and Obie O'Brien were probably the most active in not so much promoting this, but realizing that it was, number one, not dangerous to the taxpayers and might be really helpful down the road. Well, what happened in 2008? The recession. Everything literally went to hell. And all the financing arrangements we had for the passenger rail district died. Pear, by the way, had been prepared to commit up to $10 million to passenger rail service from Kittitas County to Seattle. That was a lot of money in those days. It's a lot of money still today. And we could have bowled it through, I have no doubt, if two things hadn't happened. If he hadn't been forced out by, quite frankly, environmental extremists who were blackmailing the company, and if the recession hadn't taken place in 2008. But here we are today, and county rail districts, there's a new bill that Representative Manweller helped draft and actually introduced in his last session as a legislator, that we can discuss in much more detail later, that would give county rail districts in counties that do not already have public facilities districts the same state financing that counties that have public facilities districts currently get. That sounds like, you know, wonderful word jargonism, but what it means is Kittitas County could receive over 25 years starting with our current state sales tax collections in this county, not local, doesn't affect any local sales tax collections. So it doesn't affect the county, doesn't affect the cities. It's only a share of what the state collects. We would have a minimum of $3 million a year for 25 years at the discretion, not of the state DOT, but of our county commissioners as rail district commissioners for the purpose of promoting passenger rail service. Grant County, which also does not have a public facilities district, $10 million a year. Lincoln County, which also does not have a public facilities district, about $1.5 million a year. Yakima County does have a public facilities district. That's what built the Arena Coliseum, whatever it is, down there, which is a great project. But you can't double dip from the same funding. So they could create a rail district, and I hope they would, and it could enter into interlocal agreements with our rail districts, but it wouldn't, it wouldn't be able to come up with the money. But the world is full of compromises. But if we had, and Grant County had, and Lincoln County had, somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million a year, that was under local control for local rail, we could get something done. And that's the great challenge here. We have the wonderful opportunity, far more than Richville. Nothing about Richville's a great town, friends there. But if we can connect ourselves with Puget Sound, which even at not blazingly fast speeds is within reasonable commuter distance. And if we can have commuter level service, not one a day each way between here and Spokane, although that's great. But if we could have 5 or 6 a day, we would achieve what the voters have already seen as desirable in Kittitas County. And I think we can get that through this session of the legislature. But what we can't do is, because we no longer have the 300-pound gorilla of Trend West backing us, we have to be part of this larger project. And that's been, quite frankly, at times tough for me, because I sit through meetings in which people talk for hours about the incredible desirability of increasing the headway between Stanwood and Puyallup by 3 minutes. And I'm like, oh, Jesus, this is horrible. Who the hell cares? Well, people in Stanwood and Puyallup care. And they don't care about Cle Elum and Ellensburg, and there's more of them than there are of us. So we can only get what we want by getting what everybody wants, but we can put together our own rail district project as part of this larger thing. A lot more detail than that. I'm not going to say it's simple, but it will not cost the taxpayers of Kittitas County $8 if they don't want to spend. It does require a 1/3 match, but that can be made in all kinds of ways, including property, leases. I know that, I've talked to some of the developers. They're actually enthusiastic about making pledges to the 1/3 match that we could then show to the legislators, look, these people want it. They're willing to, you put up your money, they'll put up their money, and they're putting it up now. So, there we have it. You know, at some later point in the relatively near future, I think we should have a formal meeting in the county board district to talk about this. Way back when, and this is not necessarily what we would do now. I've not talked about this with Amy. I've not talked about it with the commissioners. But Paul's idea was that the most sensible way to go about this was to not delegate, because they can't delegate their legal authority, but was to authorize or, you know, wink at myself and Jim Armstrong, who was then head of the chamber, to work on this without any real authority, but with the expectation that we would come back to the commissioners when we had something for them. That's great. I would love to have that same, and we actually have it's the minutes of a rail district meeting that was not actually a meeting, but I would love to have that reinstated, or, you know, whatever works between all. At this point, I think it would be well to have the agreement between the chamber and all of Washington, and the commissioners be, you know, looking on with interest until we had something to propose. But again, we can talk about that later. But let me leave you with the thought that we have something, we have an extraordinary opportunity that's in our hands. No one can take it from us. If the state DOT doesn't like it, then go to hell. You know, and they won't like it. And when they die, I don't know where they're going, but you know, I hope they're a bit more careful in religious matters than they are in political. So let me leave it at that. We do need to locally talk about that in the future.
And all aboard Washington would be delighted to work with whoever is appropriate on the local level to do this. We don't have, of course, any legal authority. We are a nonprofit volunteer group. However, we've been spending the last while getting all sorts of really good connections with a lot of people. And so we can provide information, we can provide suggestions, we can provide all sorts of things that I think would be very helpful for you. Just in the last couple of weeks, between our trip to Montana and our trips across the state, we've gotten all sorts of wonderful suggestions. And Patrick's about ready to jump into the comments and suggestions portion of this meeting. So we'll want your feedback. But we are definitely available to help you. For example, the folks in Montana have done a fantastic job. It's up to 16, Patrick.
Yes, they've made it official. Okay,
Yeah,
they got
it's
16.
in the Missoula Current today.
Okay.
So there's a link to it on our Facebook page. So if you want to look at that, they're doing a fantastic job of basically going around the state. Okay, their state legislature is not interested. They did have a certain number of people at the Penmore meeting, and so I think there may be more interest than there was. But for financial reasons and tax reasons and all of that, you know, it's been up to their counties to put themselves together to create the Montana project. And they've now got, I forget, I think there are 24 counties that route would serve. So they've now got the big majority of those counties. And, you know, they're even getting interest from North Dakota and Idaho on either end. And what's fascinating about that project, if you think about where that rail goes, it ends up in Spokane. Well, guess what? If you get to Spokane, then you can connect it to our East-West project. So, you know, that's the kind of discussions that we're having with that.
And there are a lot more ideas out there about what's going on, you know, that can connect to some of these efforts. You know, definitely, you know, knowing what's going on with this teleworking thing and seeing how people across the state, you know, how a lot of people have moved from Seattle to much of the rest of the state, you know, to get some, you know, fresh air, to enjoy, you know, smaller town life, just to, or, you know, just to be closer to family and friends. I think that really opens up some, you know, some important possibilities, you know, that we need to discuss about, you know, how do we connect digital commuters? How do we connect people who, you know, might need to go within, might need to have options within the region that don't currently exist now? That could be commuter rail to Seattle. That there was a gentleman who is from Washington originally, currently living in Japan for work reasons, who took a look at the East-West project and some of the things in there about how there was tremendous demand within the Yakima and Kittitas valleys for better connective options. He proposed the idea of a Cle Elum to Tri-Cities sort of local train service, something like a commuter or regional rail line serving the valley, you know, because there's a few less track constraints here than there are west of Cle Elum. And also, you know, a lot of interest for travel within the valley. So I think there are all of these different concepts that we should be talking about and bringing to the table, and then taking that next step of how do we make it happen? How do we, you know, how do we bring together the resources, you know, the support and the finances, you know, to really make these a reality? And that's, you know, that's what we're all about here at All Aboard Washington. We want to make things happen. We don't just want to be, you know, having these conversations, and 10 years from now we come back and, oh, well, the last study went out of date, we got to do another study. We want to make things happen. And I think we have an amazing opportunity, better than at any point before, pretty much in the history of our country, but certainly within the history of Amtrak, to expand rail service and to really better connect our whole region. So there are 3 ways in which we think that you can help us with regard to getting the ball rolling, or getting the train rolling, I guess, in this case. The first is awareness. A lot of people simply don't know that the East-West project or that the former, you know, Suncadia commuter rail efforts existed. Something that we've heard time and time again from local officials and from our members who talk about the project is that, you know, particularly here in Central Washington, is that they mention the project to their family and friends, or to, you know, a fellow representative, and people simply didn't know that it existed. What? We had this project on the books? No way! I had no idea. That's what we hear a lot of the time. And so really it all starts with making sure that we're having these conversations, making sure that there is more awareness. Tell your friends and family about it. You know, see what you can find about the project. And we as an organization are trying to provide resources, you know, whether it's through these sorts of presentations and these community meetings, or whether it's on our website or our Facebook page, about what are the possibilities, what is on the books, and what can we do. So starting with that, improving awareness. And then, of course, we need support from our representatives at every single level of government, you know, from the mayor to the city council, to county commissioners, to MPOs, to other regional organizations like that, to Olympia, to DC. Everybody talks with everybody else. Everybody knows what's on, you know, everybody's minds, what constituents are thinking, you know, what's of interest, what are the topics of concern. And having these conversations, you know, building these relationships with representatives at all levels of government and letting them know about the possibilities is really critical, especially now with the Senate infrastructure bill coming out, offering so much more money than ever before for rail improvement we have to be ready for that. We have to hit the ground running with that. And it starts by having these conversations on where are we at and where do we need to be going. We think that there are some great talking points that we can have with this, because we've known for far too long that we haven't had our transportation priorities straight. We've spent way too much money doing a lot of projects that don't really improve mobility, that don't really improve connectivity, that don't contribute to our three E's of equity, economics, and environment, that don't improve accessibility in interconnectivity. So we need to get back to square one. We need to snap out of this obsession we have with not addressing these issues, and we need to stop kicking the can down the road. We need to take prudent short-term actions. We can't just be doing these long-range plans. Yes, it's good to have long-range plans. It's good to know where we want to go in the long run, but we've got to figure out how to put together these short-term steps, what we can do over the next couple of years to build up toward that, and then actually do it. We believe that better passenger rail across the state, whether it's commuter rail, Amtrak Cascades, east-west, long distance, whatever that might be, better investment and better utilization of rail is really going to be critical toward addressing these concerns that we have and getting our state back on track toward addressing its most critical priorities. And then finally, grassroots advocacy. There aren't a lot of groups like All Aboard Washington that do the work that we do, and only recently have all of these possibilities started to come together all at once in order to really make a big difference and really take action. And Charlie and I are honored to do this. We absolutely love the work that we do, to serve the people of Washington through our work at All Aboard Washington, but it takes a lot of resources. There's a ton that goes into it, and with more opportunities comes more emails, more phone calls, more meetings, all of this. And we have very limited resources to take advantage of all these opportunities. So anything that you can do helps. We need volunteers to help us with community outreach, with whether that's writing content on our website, helping us organize our website, helping us publish articles in our newsletter, writing posts on social media, submitting articles to like I mentioned before with the vision article I wrote, which I submitted to the American Public Transportation Association's Speed Lines newsletter. There's a lot going on. We need to edit our newsletter. We have a lot that goes into event planning. All of these things require resources, and we need people to help us. The people who work with All Aboard Washington are our heart and soul. That's what makes our organization tick, and that's what helps us achieve our mission and vision. And our leadership too. Our leadership plays the incredibly important role of determining our organization's policy, helping us reach our fundraising goals, helping coordinate with our government affairs director on government relations, and with networking in communities across the state and across the country, really. We need help with that, and we need leadership with that. And it takes money. I don't go to Starbucks, but coffee isn't free. Diesel isn't free. I drive a TDI. All these things that we put together takes time and effort and money. And we're able to do a lot with the little that we have, but it isn't enough. We need any support that you have, whether through your own personal donations or whether that's connecting us with local businesses or other groups who have an interest in these things and want to make it happen and have the financial resources to make it happen. That makes an enormous difference, and we can't thank you enough for anything that you can do on this front to support All Aboard Washington and the work that we do.
And
So
we take credit cards.
And we take credit cards. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I do appreciate your patience with all of that. There's a lot going on here, but we want to hear from you. That's why we're here. And we want to see what we can do to help Ellensburg's needs. How can we help you with the challenges that Ellensburg's facing? What are your top priorities? And is there something that we're missing? Is there something that we need to be talking about in Olympia with our legislators? Something that we need to be educating our members and the region and the state about when it comes to transportation here in the Kittitas Valley? So here we've got a map right here of kind of what's going on.
Charlie, Patrick, were you able to touch base with the 13th district folks in Moses Lake on your trip?
We didn't. Unfortunately, just with the timing, we weren't able to have any meetings there. And when we were first looking at this, we didn't quite catch that I think is that the Grant County Rodeo was going on.
Oh.
So yeah, and
I
so
didn't realize that either.
all the hotels were booked. We somehow managed to snag one at the last minute, but all the meeting spaces weren't available. And yeah, just I think with the timing of us getting in last night from Ritzville,
Yeah,
it just was.
completely understand.
But we that definitely we want to talk more with Grant County.
You know, we're already working on our next trips, okay?
Mhm.
One of the things we want to do, for example, is have a collegiate train track, and we want to go to all the places that have colleges, including Ellensburg, that would be aimed at the students, because obviously those folks are going to be interested. We wanted to go to Pullman this time, but they're not in session yet. So, you know, it was a matter of let's find a time when we can find, you know, when the students are there and move forward. We're also working on a north-south train track that will do the I-5 corridor up through Canada. You know, we've got lots of plans in the works. So we do want to go to some of the places that we weren't able to do this time.
Yeah, I was just curious if you.
Yeah,
had-
no, thank you so
had been
much.
able To do that yesterday.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think Poland starts Monday, right? Just a couple days, right? So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's, you know, you try and juggle all of
Yeah.
these, and most of it worked really well. So, but there were just a couple that we just couldn't find an appropriate time.
Sure, well, like Sandpoint, I thought
Yes.
we put something together in Sandpoint.
Right.
We can, but not in the time frame that we had going, so yeah,
Mhm. So we'll keep working on it.
exactly.
But I mean, that's what we realized, that this is all about relationships. This is all about, making sure that, we as an organization, we as individuals are are having these conversations, making sure everyone's up to date. And it's a lot of work, but it's something that we want to do the best that we can to do. So that way we can all take advantage of all of these amazing federal and investment opportunities that we have ahead of us, and that we can really, bottom line, make a difference in the connectivity of Central and Eastern Washington.
And we've also been invited to participate in the fall transportation session of Penmore, which is going to be in Vancouver, BC. So that's in November.
Mhm.
So we're looking at that, I mean, because they were very pleased with what we did with them. We understand that that's going to be on their Facebook, or no, I guess it's going to be on YouTube. And so you'll be able to see what we did there. And I think it's going to be on Montana Public Radio as well. So, there's just a lot of, activity going on that we're participating in, not just our organization, but sort of the larger transportation folks. We've been working with a number of other organizations, everybody from the Sierra Club of Washington to the Disability Rights Washington, and everybody in between. People who care about, how do you get out of your front door? Do you have sidewalks? Do you have, all the local stuff? Do you have transit? And then how do you get out of your community? How do you, can you take a train or a bus to, whatever place that you need to be? Our friends in Ritzville yesterday were telling us, that they used to go on day trips to Spokane when they were young. I mean, those are the kinds of mobility that people need that they just don't have anymore. They have one bus a day at 3:00 in the afternoon to Spokane now. So if you don't have a car, how do you go anywhere?
The problem that, you guys got a lot of good news and stuff like that, but I've been involved in the train station since 2009 to 2021, and I stopped counting the hours I've donated because I had to keep track of things, and I was close to 19,000 hours that I've donated, plus a lot of money. And working on the train station, I've had numerous people stop by. Everybody was always enthusiastic. I used to write articles and stuff like that in the newspaper. I once offered the college to do a thesis, which I would have donated money to write the best thesis on how to have rail service back into Ellensburg to Kittitas County, and I never could get any takers. I mean, they were interested, but you can't force people, you can't push people. And, like I said, everybody that ever comes down there, they would love to ride a train. And because I've been a member probably, for over 10 years, I'm a life member in a lot of train organization. I've probably been involved with the Northern Pacific Railroad Society, Great Northern Railroad Society. I'm a life member of the Golden Colorado Museum. I'm a life member at the Toppenish Museum and stuff like that. We're all very, very, very interested in one of the best things. I've traveled across the United States probably 6 times, and I've always enjoyed, from riding a train, getting a private room and stuff like that, and enjoying, it's not something when you hop on a jet, everything's really fast. And so, I learned to entertain myself, watch movies and stuff like that. Great little player or something like that. But, it was good, and like I said, I used to come here. My family's been here for 133 years. I used to ride in Northern Pacific here to visit my grandparents with my mother and stuff like that, and riding the Great Northern. That's what got me really, really interested in always in train service. I used to be a big collector of real train memorabilia and stuff like that. And I love riding trains. And I think it's very important to keep pursuing this, but you need people. When I introduced Bruce to all aboard Washington, we had a meeting and stuff like that. I made a call to you, that I was getting Bruce involved and stuff like that. And so I just let him take, the lead, because I'm not a public official. And Corey's been great, Manuel was great. Judy and Tom, always been very, supportive. And but you need the public outcry, and that's what I've always said. You need to have forums where people can actually come here, and listen to what you have to say, because you get a lot done with everybody being involved. It's like I said, people always want to ride the train. And when they had, I remember one time, coming here, we had Washington dinner train, and the train was stopped at the train station. That was probably, my kids were really little, probably about 2002 or something like that. But there's a lot of interest, and I, like I said, I used to go on the Washington dinner train, a lot. And they had a rider. It was over 800,000 people a year that would ride that dinner train. Huge economical, to everybody. And like I said, that's what I always talked about, because the depot was the start of Ellensburg. It brought people, it brought its goods and services and stuff like that. And that was really the start, because Snoqualmie Pass was not much back then. And, like I said, it sounds like a really good opportunity. I would. So you don't have these train slowdowns and stuff like that. I would implement and use part of the northern, the Milwaukee roads, and where you have, a big collector of Milwaukee stuff.
Yeah.
You could run a track where like you're going past Easton, and you got two bridges side by side. They're just as old. It's good. You could go across and go over, and it should have big sightings and stuff like that. When the freight trains and stuff like that are coming by, instead of, because it's difficult in a lot of areas, when you have river and stuff like that, to have a proper sighting for some of these super trains and stuff like that. you know,
Yeah,
that they're-
that's a big problem nowadays.
Right,
Yeah.
but if you could go over to the Milwaukee, because as far as I know, Milwaukee's still in the rail bank.
Mhm.
I mean, Milwaukee was the best. I'm a North Pacific guy, but the Milwaukee was the best pass because of the grade versus, if it was me, I would bore the tunnel lower, and then you don't have that big super, grade.
Yeah, one of the things to say about this map, okay, is this is things that can be done with existing infrastructure.
Right.
The things you're talking about, absolutely.
Yeah, because the road beds are still there,
Right.
they need to be addressed, and like I say, if you have trains and scheduling and stuff like that, if you could, keep on time and stuff like that, and where you need a big siding,
Mhm.
instead of trying to build it right next to an tight environment, be over like in the canyon, from coming from Cleellum,
Yeah.
go over on the other side, because the bridges and everything are still there, the tunnels are there, yes, everything needs to be,
Yeah.
upgraded, but you have that where you could go over there, which would help.
And there's more, there's more interest right now in DC than there has been in many, many years. So, we're all waiting to see what the infrastructure bill's finals numbers look like. But it got through the Senate. The House will be looking at it in September. And we're all feeling like we're close. We're feeling like there's going to be money. There's money specifically set aside for places that are underserved. There are places that there are several categories that Ellensburg would fit into that they're planning to give money to. Okay, underserved communities, communities that used to have train service don't anymore. The corridors, I think Patrick mentioned, between the top 100 metropolitan areas, and Seattle is 15 and Spokane is 99. So we would fit in that category. So, there's any number of places where there's going to be money for the kinds of projects that we're talking about. And again, it hasn't passed yet, but it looks like it's possible.
Because, like I said, it is kind of a nuisance. I put more of the freight on the High Line, on the Great Northern, and like I said, when you go across country, you take out of King Street Station, you go there, and then you sit there and you wait for a long time for the dining car and one other car to come up from Pasco. So if you could alleviate that and use a lot of the Northern Pacific, and then head down, you get rid of that bottleneck there that you have. Spokane.
I think there are 2 points that are really worth bringing up here that, based on kind of what we've been learning about here at All Aboard and with a lot of our colleagues about how to address some of these things. I mean, there's the Virginia thing I talked about where VDOT actually did an analysis of what it would cost. And then they actually went the extra step to compare cost and benefits of doing, a highway project or a rail project. I think a similar thing could also be brought up here if we're talking about airport expansion. I think we've all heard about that possibility of a second major Puget Sound airport, or I guess technically third if we're factoring in that Payne Field is now a thing, that they want to build another kind of international airport in Thurston County. I mean, Charlie and I think a lot of people at All Aboard have talked about, well, what if the state stopped spending money on SeaTac and it just, if it found a way, despite the complexities of the existing rail network, despite some of the choke points, but if we start to have that conversation about what could we spend on our rails instead to take away a lot of the local traffic from SeaTac and improve accessibility by air. How many flight slots a day could we take away from, Seattle to Portland service, which is not as good for the environment, which is a lot more inconvenient in terms of, the distances that you want to cover with planes. Make better use of SeaTac for international or long distance capacity and put more of the local and regional capacity into our rail network. What if we had what if we had more frequent train services up and down the I-5 corridor? What if we had more frequent and more better connected train services across the region. Then we wouldn't have to be wasting as much money on expanding airports. We can make better use of the airport capacity. We could do the same with our highway network. So I think there's part of that argument that, and additionally, this is something we learned about at Penwar. We had there was a gentleman who gave a presentation there about rail restoration efforts. This might actually be a new service between Edmonton and Calgary in Alberta in Canada. And one of the points that was brought up there is that while there's this just kind of understanding that rail is more expensive to build, but in actuality, when they did the costs of building a 2-track railway versus the cost of doing the same with a 4-lane highway, which would provide a similar amount of capacity, they actually found the railway to be less expensive. And then you bring up a great point about, the public outcry. People don't seem to be aware of the projects that exist and a lot of the information out there, which we're trying to do a better job as an advocacy group of letting people know about. But I mean, my question to you, I think you as elected officials involved here, how would we get the word out about that? What if your constituents knew about how much we're spending on existing projects versus what we could do? What sort of response do you think we can get? How could we get that out to people?
Well, like I said, I was hoping to get the newspaper, involved, but like I said, I let Bruce, because he's a public official and stuff like that, but I would have liked to have that, publicized that there was a meeting on rail service, here today, but
we did send the information to them, but we didn't have the venue yet, and so that was a bit of a problem. But we can do more. We can do future ones, and we have actually gotten quite good publicity in some places.
Because when I've opened up the depot and stuff like that, the first time I opened it up, I probably for the 200th anniversary, I had probably over 1,000 people that showed up. When Jim Armstrong retired, I probably had close to 300 people there. And it's my dream is for the depot has always been a transportation hub, and it is going to be becoming a reality real soon.
I think people have a really short attention span. So if you could make a 30-second video clip to send out to us that focused on the Virginia project that basically said, hey, the state of Virginia looked at spending $1 billion on whatever for a roadway and compared it to what they could do to a train station, which gave us this, this, and this for 1/3 of the money. And we're poised in Washington State to be able to do something similar. If you want to know more, join me at this clip, something that short that I could send all my friends and I get some involvement. But people really do have a short attention span. If I can capture them with something about, my grandparents or my wife's parents live in Cheney. My grandfather lives in Spokane. They don't visit us during the wintertime because the roadways, they can still drive. My dad, 78, can still drive. My grandfather in the 90s can still drive, but not during the winter. But if we had a train route, they could come over for Christmas instead of us having to try to go to there.
Yeah, they can
Take
do
a
it.
look at the videos that Montana's done, because they have something exactly like that. They've got like a 4-minute one, but then they've also got a 30-second.
Charlie, is that on their
I
website?
invite you to go to the other two to watch, to learn a little more, to come along with me on this journey.
So how do you guys do with Dennis Washington? Like I said, I've been involved with the Livingston Depot a lot over the years.
I don't. Dennis Washington.
He's the owner of the
Montana Railing.
yeah.
I don't think we have any personal connections with him. However,
Strohmeyer does.
Dave Strohmeyer with Missoula County, who's he helped spearhead that Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. He does.
They used to have the Montana Daylight, and it was a lot of fun. The last time that it existed for quite a few years. Every other year they would take. The first year, unfortunately, I missed it. The SPNS steam train, and they would come through here, and then we'd all meet up at Sandpoint, Idaho, and then go to Billings, and we had probably 20 cars, and ridership people were paying $600-700 a ticket, you know, to go.
Mhm.
And it was a big, you know, it was a huge deal.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you know, it went out in 2004. And I rode the SDNS and did it. And it was just, you know, it was amazing, you know, a lot of fun to be able to eat on a train and spend the night on the train.
Well,
Yeah.
and the one of the things we talked about yesterday in Ritzville is that there is actually a lot of interest there in trying to do a demonstration train. And someone who had spoken with Amtrak previously about the possibility of the demonstration train got some good response, but I think just kind of with what's been going on with the pandemic, it was a little hard to, you know, to keep that going.
We
But
used to have the
yeah.
American Freedom Train that
Yeah.
Mhm.
our American Orient Express, you know, would come through here. And then once in a while, when there was a problem on Stampede Pass,
Mhm.
Amtrak would, you know, would go through here that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I would see, you know, the problem is you have a lot of dark territory. You know,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
it's that they have spent millions of dollars, you know, because I've watched them, you know, putting ribbon rail, you know, which is welded rail, and so you don't when you ride the train, you don't go here go clickety 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 click.
Yeah,
you know,
better
it's
for
just-
reliability.
it's
Yeah.
extremely smooth, and so the trains have gone a lot faster. You know, they're going past people now at 60 miles an hour.
Excellent. Okay.
PTC is the next one though, because Stampede Pass does not have PTC. So somebody's got to pay for that. And
Yeah.
you know, BNSF doesn't want to pay for it.
For those of you who are not familiar, positive PTC, positive train control, is a system that has recently been required to be implemented on the federal level, and they're all railroads that carry passengers and that have certain hazardous material are required to have PTC. Now, Stampede Pass is a route that has been exempted from it because what the nature of the route as it stands right now is that it mostly because Stevens Pass is the shallower of the two existing mountain grades, and the Columbia River crossing is also very busy. More trains run, heavier trains that are loaded with materials run west off of either Stevens Pass or the Columbia River, and then empty trains go east. Another dynamic is that Stampede Pass Tunnel is just a little bit too short to accommodate double stack freight, and therefore only single level cars can go through there, like oil cars, grain cars, things like that are short enough. We understand that an Amtrak Superliner can fit through, but only barely. So that presents a challenge, and restarting passenger rail service on there would likely require the institution of PTC. There are a few Amtrak routes that have been exempted for various reasons, but we think that restarting it on the state level would require PTC, and that would be a major investment.
I have a question on the double stack piece. I know the Seaport Alliance has an interest in double stacking that tunnel, and I know that our local ag exporters have an interest in double stacking that tunnel as well. What kind of impact would that have on passenger rail?
Well, what we understand is that as according to the 2019 Washington State Rail Plan, the projections for freight traffic growth in Washington State under all of the various scenarios that they have show that Stampede Pass, because of the current configuration without double stack compatibility, is the only route which would actually have significantly available free capacity under any of the growth scenarios. And so we think that probably a point to consider about allowing double stack through Stampede Pass would be that that would more evenly distribute traffic throughout the network, depending on what other benefits or what other upgrades BNSF conducts to the entirety of the route. That could overall probably positively influence the availability of alternative routes. But when it comes to passenger rail, that may mean that there would also be more traffic that would have to be considered when expanding service. So in terms of how it would affect passenger rail, on the one hand, it might improve reliability on the rest of the network where passenger trains are already going, because there would be more alternative routes. And if something were to happen to any of the other routes, of course, then Stampede Pass serves as a backup. But that may mean there would also be potentially a little bit more competition for passenger trains, particularly if we're talking about expanding commuter service to Seattle. So I think, I mean, there are certain benefits and drawbacks. I would think in any case, having the extra capacity is probably a better thing for the overall network. But when it comes to passenger rail, that may present some additional challenges because there would be a little bit more free flow of freight traffic, and that could mean that there would be more operational challenges to consider with implementing passenger rail, whether commuter or long distance.
I know you have a maritime background, and you may already be aware of this, but 10 years or so ago, when Bill Hinkle was in the legislature, he was contacted by some folks who wanted to talk about a new rather than double stacking, and the cost was surprisingly comparable. Apparently, the rock work there is fairly decent as far as being able to put a 10 or even a 20-mile tunnel at a much lower level through the Cascades, which is as I understand it, the only way of substantially increasing port accessibility from Alaska to Mexico.
I wasn't aware of that, but I can certainly ask Bill.
Yeah,
Some more detail.
But another tunnel gives you so many more options too, if something goes wrong with the route.
yeah, and obviously not cheap at
Oh,
all.
no.
But not,
Thank you for
but
joining us.
surprisingly,
If you want to take part.
not
Yeah.
much more expensive than
It's a re-
chipping out the top
The
or the
existing,
bottom of
yeah.
the existing.
We'll see, hopefully the federal aid package put something in there for some rail work.
Well, the
I think
folks,
there will be.
the folks up in Wenatchee, Rufus Woods, and that group spent 20 years promoting Grand Coulee Dam. And they got nowhere at all. But when the New Deal came along, even though Woods hated Franklin Roosevelt and Clarence Dill and the other Democrats in this state, they were prepared to take advantage of that. And Grand Coulee got built. And, that's maybe the position we're in.
I think so. I mean, the discussions that we're hearing, we had the Assistant Secretary of Transportation speak to us the other day in Montana. The head of the Federal Railroad Administration is speaking to the Montana people next week, I think. They want to do this. This is really their raison d'etre in DC right now. It's all about the infrastructure.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you who took time out of your weekend to come and meet with us.
That the pandemic seems to have taught all of us two things: that you can work remotely, and that everyone has more of a desire to connect with other humans, especially if they care about them ever before being isolated for the last 18 months with a piece of cloth on your face and all this. I think if you make a short intro video to loop people in, just talking about, just use Virginia as an example of the same money, if you can do this and you can give people access that don't have access to their family and friends, and then invite them to do that, that's how we can quickly spread the word and get some.
And that's something I have to say, if I don't know if any of you have any connections with the sorts of people would do that. We have, this is a graphics designer that Charlie knows, who helped us come up with this map. Really nice guy, and he has really limited capacity in terms of what he can do, specifically to assist all aboard. I think anything kind of in the, whether it's with graphic design or with video production, I don't know if you have any connections that would be, willing, interested and able to help a 501c3 like us with things like that. I think that's another major need, I think, for the organization, because we realize the importance of having good materials. And that's something I think we have stepped up our game on a lot, but we need to do even better. So
Patrick, I'm happy to meet with you in regards to that.
okay, yeah.
if we have that in staff and interns this year.
Okay, yeah, if you've got that capacity, that would be an amazing help for our organization. And because I mean, the SPRA was able to get some things with some local firms there, but I think just in terms of what our own capacity as an organization, any help that we can get is greatly appreciated. So I'll give you my card.
I'd like some more information on the Montana inter-county connection as well. One of the things that COVID has done as well is galvanize some counties over here against some of the governor's policies. So we
Not quite a Their website is bigskyrail.org.
Okay.
And that will give you all sorts of information about it. That they're having their board meeting next week, a couple of days from now, and it will be available electronically. So I'm sure they'd be happy to have you sit in. I think we're going to be there. I think it's on my calendar. Let me check.
And just to add into that, because I think there's a really important connecting point here. The first thing is that kind of with what's going on with Montana, the discussions we've had with Dave and as well with Elaine Clegg, who is the city council president for the city of Boise. Based on kind of where the state legislatures are at in Montana and Idaho, and unfortunately, I think it's quite similar here. What they are seeing as kind of the low-hanging fruit, with the federal policy, is the restart of some long-distance services. In this case, kind of what's being envisioned would be that for Washington, there would be the restart of a route which would essentially replicate what was called the North Coast Limited, which went from Seattle to Chicago via this route would go via this route here, Stampede Pass, and then through southern Montana and southern North Dakota to reconnect with the tracks there and continue to Chicago. Based on what's kind of going on the federal level, if we're talking about restarting passenger rail service here, that's probably the easy one to get. The state supported route, as we know, it's been going on for a long time, and we think that there's going to be enough interest to get some of the stuff passed through, given that there's going to be more federal money for state corridors. But in terms of having that come more quickly, with like what you're saying with the governor, we're trying to reach out to the governor. We're trying to have conversation. We're trying to say, hey, we can't just be talking about high-speed rail. We need to be talking about, the short term. We need to be talking about what we can do with our existing rail infrastructure, if high-speed rail is ever going to have a chance. But so far, we haven't been able to get that far. And we know that there are a lot of interests that are connected with high-speed rail. And we're just trying to find kind of a way to see how we can integrate that with all the energy going to high-speed rail and get a lot of the support that's going toward high-speed rail to think about east-west and say, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we get started with this? I mean, really what it's all down to is market building. That if, high-speed rail in all the corridors where it works, has to be working with a strong transportation network, and we do not have that strong transportation network, and we know the impact that has on communities across the state, and we know that high-speed rail is not going to be the affordable transportation solution that everyone's thinking it is. The fares for high-speed rail are going to be somewhere along the lines of 52 cents a mile, compared to Amtrak Cascades, which provides it at 19 to 26 cents per mile, and Sounder Commuter Rail provides it for about 10 cents a mile. So when we're trying to integrate all these together, we know high-speed rail can solve some problems. High-speed rail can definitely help with the airport congestion, things like that, but it can't stand on its own. We need to be bringing more players into the conversation. We need to be having, this network that we need, that we have right here. So I think linking that into, oh my gosh, where was I going with this? Linking that in and communicating that concept and trying to have a better conversation with the governor about, hey, what are we going to be doing? We can't just do this, this fun, dare I say, pet project. Yeah.
I think additionally, with, like we've stated with the pandemic, some really good relationships have been created. And so I think the way that the chamber can interact with that is not only as the ADO, but as also a county chamber. We can create communication with Yakima Chamber of Commerce, and we can get that conversation going. And additionally, it has opened up the opportunity with other associations, the Hospitality and Restaurant Association, the Association of Washington Business. those are relationships that have been created through the pandemic, to which then I can go to Chris at Department of Commerce and say, why is this not part of Department of Commerce's plan?
Good.
And we actually just got in touch with someone who is at Penware and Commerce too. So we know that Commerce is interested in working with us. Lisa Brown.
Yeah, she's the
from
director, but Chris is the operations.
Okay,
Who pretty much, he's the one
excellent.
that puts everybody into silos of interest, right? He's the
Okay.
one that kind of manages, but Lisa's a
Okay.
great contact. She's wonderful.
I think anything we can do to help expand those connections and see where we can collaborate would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
We've had good conversations with Berlin Best at Yakima. And
She's a spitfire.
yeah, she's good. And so she wasn't able to come to our meeting there, but I mean, those, anybody that you think we should be talking to, we would be delighted, and we only have limited time and ability to come to like local meetings, but as you said, everybody's used to doing things electronically now.
Yeah.
So, if Patrick or I can sit in on something, we're more than happy to do that. So that's I think ways that we can communicate. And, we've really enjoyed this conversation that we've been having while we've been taking the local meetings. And we definitely are going to be doing it again. But, don't wait. If you want to talk to us, you know where we are.
Mhm, yeah.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you because we can do something like that.
Great. Well, we've got less than an hour to get to Cleella
Oh, yeah, yeah.
for our next meeting.
I'll email you.
Thanks for
Okay.
coming.
Yeah, I got